In this video, we will look at the dynamic axes that are controlled by the measure selections here with the single select slicers that have been configured. So the functionality is such that I have the different measures associated with these properties of the elements, and I can flip between the selections, and the scatter plot will dynamically adjust the axes selections here. So similar to the video on conditional formatting with a dynamic measure, this relies on having tables set up in my data model that simply have a list of the available measures, and they're disconnected tables. So I have a separate one for x-axis and y-axis, and in no way is this related to the main elements table. So if you watch the previous video on the conditional formatting for the scatter plot, it's a very similar setup to property selection where it's simply a disconnected table. I chose to call it out separately for property selection and X and Y axis. I would need at least two disconnected tables in this case because I don't want the value of X being selected here to also impact Y. So I would need at least two. I happen to have three because of something else going on here with conditional formatting where I wanted to structurally split that out. But by getting by here with the two separate disconnected tables in this case for x-axis and y-axis, what this gives me is a level of independence where I can choose something on x and the y selection is going to be independent of that. Now the measure setup is really where it comes into play, and if I look at the scatter plot here and look at the fields, you'll see that there's a measure for x-axis selection and y-axis selection that happens to be in my element table. And looking at this property, this is the exact same measure that I showed in the conditional formatting video, but I'm simply taking a selection based on the selected value of either the x-axis or y-axis. For this example, it happens to be from the x. So whatever someone has selected from this slicer, it's grabbing that value. And then there's a switch statement here that takes the first condition that evaluates to true. So if the selection on this X slicer happens to be for atomic number, it's going to evaluate and give me the sum of atomic number. And because all of the elements are split out individually, I can get away with using sum as an aggregate. I could use min, I could use max, sum, any kind of aggregate function will work because I'm getting down to the individual element. If I had to worry about grouping of the elements or some other type of way of aggregating the elements together on the scatter plot, then some might get me into a little bit of trouble there. But because of the way that the visual is structured, I can get away with using sum as my value here. But essentially, it just goes in and evaluates this current selection. It says at which point is the selection equal to whatever the text value is called out here in the switch statement, and then gives the appropriate dynamic measure value here as the value of my main x-axis selection measure, and then that measure ends up on the appropriate axis, in this case the x-axis. So this is the main area of complexity for the measure. There's really not a whole lot going on in terms of the scatter plot itself. There's no trick behind it. It's just a standard scatter plot, but it's enriched a little bit with the disconnected table and with that dynamic measure for both x-axis selection and y-axis selection. So I think it's a good trick to have if you wanted to have any kind of comparison tool like this, where if you had a lot of measures and you just want to do more exploratory work with the data, this could be a good handy trick to have in your pocket.